Hey everyone, thanks for joining today. For today, I wanted to give you guys a quick sneak peek at some of the topics that we discussed during the cyber resilience architecture workshop. This is just going to be a quick overview to kind of give you understanding of the approach that we take during the workshop and some of the topics that we discuss. So keep in mind, this is a really huge topic, right? We're barely going to be scratching the surface, but for today, what we want to review is the cyber resilience pillars that A&M's created. The pillars really help us break down the topics into different focus areas so that we can have conversations around each one, and hopefully makes it easier for us to identify areas of improvement, and hopefully allows us to prioritize projects and help develop solutions for our customers. So let's go ahead and get into it. When we're talking about disaster recovery, typically the first thing that comes to mind is some sort of natural disaster or failure, right? That's going to take out a portion of your infrastructure. But in reality, nowadays you're actually more likely to experience a disaster due to some sort of cybersecurity incident or some sort of bad actor. To prevent this, we really need coordination between all teams within an organization, and that'd be the network side, the security side, and the data center side. And with so many aspects of IT involved here, where do we even begin? So this is where the A&M pillars come into play, and they are anticipate, withstand, recover, and adapt. So before we get into each one of those, let's go ahead and start off by building out what we typically see in a data center. So we'll start off with our infrastructure here, place it in a way that makes most sense. All right, we have a router, firewall. And keep in mind that these represent devices that are redundant within itself: two routers, two firewalls, two core and fabric switches. So we'll connect those together. There'll be some sort of BGP connection up to the cloud so that we can have internet redundancy. And then we'll build out our virtual infrastructure. Connect that to data center fabric. Our infrastructure will have storage. And then, of course, we'll have a data protection appliance. And, part of the workshop, we discussed in depth your data protection strategy to see if there's any sort of gaps of, where you're at, or we can kind of discover ways to improve that strategy. But again, that's more of an in-depth conversation held during the workshop. Okay. So we have our data center infrastructure, right? And if we take a look back at the pillars and see how they relate to cyber resilience, we'll see that the first one is anticipate. And when we're talking about anticipate, we're really talking about planning and zero trust architecture. So the first one, planning, this is really the first step in being resilient to, some sort of malicious attack. Doing things like conducting a business impact analysis or having your incident response plan clearly defined. These are going to give you the best chance at reacting to or defending against a cybersecurity attack. The second is zero trust architecture. ZTA is a topic within itself. We have an entire workshop dedicated to that. But in the workshop, what we discuss is the need to implement microsegmentation here on the workloads in the data center, right? We want to make sure that these workloads only have access to the things that they need and nothing more. We could do this with a few different technologies, but there are really a few solutions that we prefer to see in the data center, and that would be Cisco ACI, VMware NSX, and a couple of agent-based solutions provided by Guardicore and Illumio. The other thing is that our ZTA design requires us to place firewalls between our end users and the data center. So we'll go ahead and build that out. I connect it here, connect him to the firewall so that if he needs to communicate with the data center, that communication is protected. So the one thing I want to point out here is that on our firewall policies, we want to make sure that we're using a mix of granular policies as well as advanced features. A lot of times what we'll see is that, sometimes these firewalls may just have a permit IP any, and we're using some IPS inspection on there to catch malicious traffic, or maybe we've had this big, long access policy that's being built over the years. It's very specific, but maybe we're not implementing some of those advanced features yet. We really need both in that sense, right? We want to make sure that we have granular policies so that we can limit exactly what traffic gets to those endpoints and your data center, and then inspect that traffic to look for things that could be hidden in encrypted traffic, like malware and that sort of thing, right? So that's where our advanced features would come into play. Okay, so moving on to the second pillar, we have withstand. And when we're talking about withstand, we're talking about building in redundancy into our infrastructure. So how do we do that? Well, typically that would just be building out a secondary data center, right? So we'll go ahead and copy this side, move it over, and then we'll connect it all together so that we have our internet redundancy built in. Then we're going to have our data center interconnect here between sites, right? Okay, so now that we have our primary data center and our secondary data center built out, we see that each one mirrors each other, right? Each one's going to have its own network infrastructure, its own compute, its own storage, and of course, its own data protection. And so again, and they'll be connected in a way that if we have a failure at one site, the other site should take over, and we should be able to have full connectivity to be able to withstand any sort of failure. And not only just failures that, could be revolved around, some sort of natural disaster, but things that are more likely to happen, say like, human error or loss of power or some sort of misconfiguration or a software failure, right? Things like that. So now the big problem here is that while we protect ourselves in one aspect, we've actually extended our failure domain into another. And so, as I said, being that these data centers are typically layered to adjacent, or maybe you're not as far along on your microsegmentation journey as you'd like to be, this allows, malware to be able to run freely between these devices, right, or between these sites. And that's something that we obviously don't want. So, and that's where our third pillar comes into, recovery. So if we do end up experiencing some sort of cyber event, we're going to need a clean infrastructure to recover into. And this is a place where we're going to need to replicate data to, and then ultimately recover that data from. And this needs to be a completely separate infrastructure that's part of our on-site failure domain. And so the most common way to do this would be to build out a separate cloud infrastructure. This is something that you're going to want to do well ahead of experiencing any sort of cybersecurity incident. You wouldn't want to be reactive or try and spin this cloud infrastructure up in the middle of a disaster, because really at that point it's too late. You're going to want to build this out ahead of that disaster, so you should understand what that cloud architecture looks like, how your users are going to connect, and which ones. All right, so let's build out this cloud infrastructure. So let's say, this is our internet connection. We can go ahead and copy out our cloud here. And let's say we're building this out in AWS. Okay, need data devices up here. Right. Of course, we're going to want to protect our cloud as well. Let's move this down a little bit here. Connect everything up. Okay, so in it we're probably going to have an S3 bucket. We're going to have space for our VMs. We're going to have also a backup as a service cluster connected to that, and then we're also going to have some sort of way for our users to connect in. So we'll build that out. Our users, and it's typically going to be some sort of secure VPN connection to the data center, to the cloud. Okay, so our cloud infrastructure is built out. And really, this is what this will allow us to do is take advantage of our data protection features and then securely back that up to the cloud. So we'll take this connection showing our data protection moving data up to the cloud. And the cool thing here is that we can now take advantage of advanced features, right? Advanced inspection. So things like inline malware inspection is going to be able to be utilized when we're transmitting data up to the cloud. So now, if we do experience some sort of cybersecurity incident and we need to recover, our data already lives in the cloud here, and it's clean and ready to go. Now, all we have to do is log in, log into the console, make sure that all of our apps are running and our users have access to the data, and we're good to go, right? So that's one option. The other option would be to have what's called a clean room environment. Here we would take offline infrastructure with its own compute and storage, and it really just sits there and it's ready to go. So let's go ahead and build that out. So I'll take our virtual infrastructure here and then tie it to our firewall. All right, so let's get this guy out of the way. Okay, so now we have our clean room environment built out. Again, we know that it's offline. It has its own computer storage ready to go. It's sitting there clean because really nothing has access to them. We might turn them on every once in a while to maybe update them or patch them. But this is really going to provide us a clean infrastructure to recover to without really having the need to build out a separate cloud infrastructure or purchase cloud subscriptions. So this really just gives us another option to help with our recovery. All right, so the last pillar we have is adapt. And when we're talking about adapting, we're talking about hardening our systems and re-architecting our infrastructure to further protect ourselves. So let's say you are unfortunate enough to go through some sort of cybersecurity incident. The first thing that you're going to want to do after you recover is to do what's called an after-action review. You're going to want to go back in and understand how someone may have compromised you, so you could fill in the gaps and then protect those systems in the future. And typically that means that looks at hardening individual devices to protect them against known security vulnerabilities. These are going to prevent things like unauthorized access or denial of service attacks. And so, the organization called the Center of Internet Security provides a list of best practices and controls that we could put in place for all sorts of devices, whether that's a Palo Alto firewall or a Cisco iOS device. They have recommendations for endpoints like Linux and Windows machines, and they take it even a step further and provide recommendations for cloud infrastructures like AWS and Azure. And so, the recommendations would be things like enabling authentication between routing neighbors, or maybe turning off some unused services or ports so that we could protect those individual devices. Implementing these changes really just limits the ways in which bad actors can get into these devices or influence them. All right, so wrapping up, I just want to point out, that this was just a really brief overview of some of the topics that we discussed in the workshop. What you're going to see is that the workshop focuses its conversations a lot around planning and making sure that we have clear processes in place, because in reality, those are just as important, if not more important, than the solutions that you implement to protect your environment. And so with that, I hope this session gives you a good idea of what the workshop would look like, and I look forward to working with you.